Introduction. China's social credit system has been a topic of intense discussion, controversy, competing interpretations, and propaganda ever since it was first proposed in 2013. When seen as an extension of China's earlier social management surveillance systems, first implemented in 2001, the social credit system can be regarded as a broader and deeper form of behavioral management based on nudge theory, the incentivization of specific behaviors at the societal level. This is the first in a series of videos examining a recent master's dissertation on China's social credit system, providing insight from a Taiwanese student at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland who interviewed Chinese citizens in order to understand their personal views on the system. These videos present the background, research methodology, results, and conclusions of that dissertation in order to provide information on the social credit system from a perspective rarely considered in broader academic literature in the West. Unlike other studies which examine the issue from an economic, human rights, or information management perspective, this dissertation approaches the topic sociologically, using the framework of science and technology studies in order to assess how the social credit system as technology interacts with and influences members of society. This video is an introduction to the dissertation in the form of a casual interview with the author herself, covering these topics. 1. Dissertation's author and motivation. 2. Social credit systems, dystopian or utilitarian. 3. Dissertation research methodology. 4. Dissertation validation methodology. 5. Interviewee responses. 6. China's social trust crisis. 7. Overreach concerns. 8. Social credit and performativity. 9. Surveillance awareness and social behavior. 10. Author's personal conclusions. 11. Government and gaming the system. 12. Government and ulterior motives. 13. Social credit system and socialism. 14. Author's final thoughts. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Due to unavoidable constraints, the interview in this video was conducted in the suboptimal sound environment of a local cafe, so I apologize for the audio quality. Please turn on YouTube's closed captions to assist your comprehension if this option is available to you. Dissertation's author and motivation. So Jane, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, my name is Yushan Jian. I study in Science and Technology Study in University of Edinburgh. And my dissertation is about the social credit system in China. And as for why I'm interested in this topic, because actually I'm always interested in how Chinese people live in this authoritarianism and how because when you interact with Chinese people, you can find that they really enjoy and they pursue freedom somewhere else, but they live in their country and they actually have a very strong nationalism in their society. And that's one thing I want to know, how they grab their own freedom in this situation. And the second is I really enjoy episode in Netflix, the mirror the nose dive. In the whole episode, the situation is quite like how we understand social credit system at start.
Social credit systems, dystopian or utilitarian? Yep, China's social credit system has often been compared to various systems seen in that TV series Black Mirror, and some people think that's an overblown comparison and think that it's obviously it's a negative comparison, and some people think it's an unjustified comparison. Obviously, there are some similarities to those situations in Black Mirror with any state surveillance system, but the question is obviously the motivation of this state, the true motivation of the state, and of course the way that the civilians themselves interact with that system. Now, before I ask you a little bit more about that, I should make clear that you are Taiwanese yourself.
Yeah, I'm Taiwanese.
Okay, so it's important to realize that you're providing a Taiwanese perspective on a system outside your own country, so you're from the outside looking in, and from one point of view that's going to give you a more objective perspective, and from another point of view, obviously that means that you need to look on the inside, which is why you interviewed people, because you can't make thoroughly reliable judgments just on an outside perspective, right?
Yeah, because there's a FICO score in America, and actually people in America care about the score because the score have in a very professional term in sociology is called performativity. The score have performativity. It means that the score is actually just number, but it will change people's behavior because they wanted to have a better grade or a better score, so they can have a better offer in a bank when they try to get a loan or something. And yeah, and in our normal life, even though we don't really mention FICO score in America, we can talk about just like in school, if you have an A, that means that you're a good student. It means that who you are. So I don't really think that social credit system is that far from people's life. It is not just in China, or like it is really hard to understand why Chinese people do this, because in our society, this kind of system exists already.
I think you make a very good point there, and in fact, people who do comment on China's social credit system have made the observation that in some ways, as you say, it's not so very different from similar systems already used around the world, like that FICO score, in particular because that FICO score not only generates performativity, as you say, because it affects the way big people interact socially, but similar to complaints raised by people about China's social credit system, it does actually also constrain your life. It constrains you socially and it constrains you economically. So the idea of a social credit system is not very far removed from what many nations are doing at the moment anyway. It seems that people's main fear are the extent to which the information can be used or perhaps abused by the government, and the extent to which that surveillance may overreach its original intent, and of course the extent to which the system may generate, paradoxically, distrust within society, as well as the idea that the score may be manipulated by the government in ways which are beyond the control of the individual, performativity or otherwise, and I know you're going to talk about gaming this system later, and the extent to which the government's storage and manipulation of that data is transparent, or whether it's more like a black box, which is something I think that you've mentioned in your thesis. Dissertation research methodology. So now let's talk about your experimental methodology. As somebody who is living in Taiwan, and more to the point, a Taiwanese citizen investigating the social credit system of China, how did you design your experimental methodology in a manner which you believed would extract reliable results?
Well, actually, in the beginning of my dissertation, the data gathering, I have talked to my supervisor many times because they think this is really hard to do interview, especially they are a stranger and I'm a Taiwanese stranger for them. And especially after 2019, the tension between Taiwan and China is quite serious at that time. So they really don't want to be interviewed by someone they don't know. And they even didn't know what's my maybe politics or what my identity would be like. So they are really don't. In the beginning, the snowballing is not great, because I really couldn't find anyone who live in China to let me interview them. In the beginning, I interviewed 8 students in my university because they are more approachable, and actually my supervisor think that would be enough. But I don't think the people who live abroad can really let me have the insight of how people in China, in the border of China, knows what is going on or what it would be, what the system will affect their lives. So I still wanted to know what Chinese people in China really think about their system. So I asked my Malaysian friends, and I have relatives live in China, or friends who is Chinese but who already moved out of China, and introduced me their friends so I can interview them about this topic.
Dissertation validation methodology. Thanks, Jane. I'm now going to ask you a few questions about how you validated your data recognizing that this is such a sensitive topic, and in particular could be especially sensitive for people who are living in China, how did you validate your results to allow for things like masking, people giving answers which are not completely accurate, but which they think are perhaps politically correct, or answers they think they would need to give for political reasons? Or how did you account for perhaps participant reluctance, people feeling like they didn't want to participate or limited their participation to giving minimal answers and responses? How did you account for these kinds of factors when validating your data so that you would know that your results were sufficiently reliable on which to base your thesis?
Because I just mentioned that my participant has two categories. One is the student in University of Edinburgh, and the other is the Chinese people who live in China. And as for the student, they really just talk what they want, because they are outside the border and they know they are not under that strict surveillance system like the people live in China. And so I really don't need to think about their validation, because they just actually, when they answer my question, they always smoothly, and even as some more like actually this kind of stuff I couldn't really speak in China. And yeah, some people will ask me to delete what they have said, and I also do it. But I know that the interview I just did really have their validation there, because they afraid of this and they know this kind of answer is what they really think. So they might be risky if it just being published by my dissertation. And the other category is the Chinese people who live in China. Because I always ask them some previous questions like whether you are a CCP member, or like which city they live in have a very crucial factor. The first is what's their political views based on whether they are CCP members or not. And the other is when they speak with me. In the beginning, almost everyone will ask me what's the purpose, and they want to make sure of this. And some people would just keep asking me about what my identity is and whether this is only for the dissertation. And at that moment, I would know that the following interview, what I should respond, or what answers I should really consider. Will it be what they really think, or they just try to convince me that this system is good for them because they are afraid of their government?
Interviewee responses. Did you see that there was much discrepancy, should I say, did you find that there was much in the way of discrepancy between the answers provided by Chinese citizens living outside China and the Chinese participants in your study who were citizens living inside China?
Actually, there's no much difference. That's actually quite similar. But I found it really interesting is that if someone is very proud of their membership in a CCP, they will just keep telling me that this system is great and there's no disadvantage of any of this. But other people will say the pros and cons in this system. What they think about it is based on, I think, quite objective view, I would say, because they will think about their privacy as well, even though they have a more tolerance about their privacy than the foreigners. But the views they share is not that different.
Given that you found there was quite a strong correspondence between the responses you were getting from Chinese citizens living outside China and Chinese citizens living inside China, do you believe that that is good evidence that the data you were collecting has some validity? For example, if you're finding this strong correspondence between people living outside and inside China, both saying the same kind of thing about the social credit system, do you believe that that is evidence that both parties are maintaining a particular political line or view or presentation? Maybe they're all masking to a certain extent. Or do you believe that it's evidence that these two groups of people, despite being in different situations, are giving the same kind of answers because that's what they truly believe?
I think it's the latter one because even though they have different political views, but they all have a same problem in their society is the distrust problem. So they are really sick of it because whenever they trying to buy online or they try to have business dealings with other people, they will always have to think twice, even 3 times or 4 times, whether this person can be trusted, or like, would I really, or if I give the money to this stranger, will it just be vanished, or will my investment will be gone? They will always have to think about it, and for them, it is a long-lasting problem in their society. So they really want to solve it. So, at some extent, this system actually can fix this problem. No doubt, it could fix it, but it also have to sacrifice their very little freedom for it. So they are really against it because in China, they really don't have the rights that people in the rest of the world have already been entitled when they're born. So they know that their freedom is so little and so easy to be deprived. So they really don't want to sacrifice it. But yeah, if you want this system, you have to give all your privacy, all your data, and all your life to the government so they can solve it.
China's social trust crisis.
You just mentioned China's social trust problem. In the scholarly literature, this is referred to as China's social trust crisis, and it's been discussed extensively in the literature for at least a decade. Now, social trust crises are not unique to China, and they can be found documented and discussed in the literature in other countries as well. I think it's just that China's is particularly acute, and obviously the scale of it is unprecedented given the scale of Chinese society. And in particular, the government's response to that social trust crisis is definitely unique. Other countries haven't addressed it in the same way. And from what you just said a minute ago, it seems that some citizens are prepared to sacrifice a certain degree of autonomy and freedom in order to gain the benefit of some kind of management over this social trust crisis, which would otherwise impair their lives much more. So do you believe that a number of the citizens see the social credit system as even not so much even as a necessary evil, but rather as a benefit, a substantial benefit with a few relatively minor trade-offs?
I think most of them, even though they wanted to have this kind of trade-off, but they still think this system is too far because you don't need to do the surveillance system, which monitoring every aspect of their lives to solve this problem. So they actually think that it is not necessary. It can be cut off for to give them what they should have, the rights of privacy and the rights of freedom.
Overreach concerns.
So generally speaking, would you say that citizens are in favor of the utility of this program and in favor of its goals and benefits, but they consider the program to be overreaching its original goals, and they believe that it could still have substantial benefits while being scaled back to some extent and permitting civilians more autonomy and subjecting them to less government scrutiny?
Half of my interviewees always think that this can be because social credit system based on the documents CCP have published. They say that this system is based on FICO score, so they modify FICO score into their own style. Half of my interviewees always think that they should cut that to more like FICO score, and it can fix the problem they address already. This surveillance system don't need to be in everywhere in their lives.
Social credit and performativity.
You mentioned the concept of performativity earlier and the social effect that a system like this has on people who are aware that they're being scrutinized. Do you think that this can lead to individuals not simply modifying their social behavior in response to this level of scrutiny, but actually attempting to develop ways of behaving or systems of behavior which gain advantages within the system with minimal effort, what we might call gamifying the system.
Yeah, most of them always would answer me if it is necessary. I think 100% of my interviewees really don't want to change their lifestyles or their own freedom of speech. If it is necessary, if their score is too low to an extent that they're going to be in the blacklist, they will change their behavior, like helping others or try not to speak so freely on the internet. And when I ask them what kind of behavior they would change, 80% of my interviewees always say that behavior they're going to change have to be congruent with their own values. So they don't really want to change into a robot. Like they have to do everything according to the system or according to the guideline they know. So they only wanted to change the behavior they know which is beneficial in the society. And that's the thing they're willing to do if the score is really have that kind of performance.
So it seems that even though the original intent, the government's intent for this system is to improve social good generally and to create benefits for society as a whole, in actual fact, since people know they are being surveilled and since they're fully aware of at least some of the rules of the system, it seems that some of them will attempt to play the rules or gamify the system, if we like, in order to gain more personal advantage, thinking less of the overall social good and more about what they can do in any given moment to kind of min-max their scores, gain maybe the maximum amount of score with a minimal amount of effort, or perhaps allow their score to fall when it's not necessary for them to have a high score, and then increase their score later with performativity and social demonstrations of conformity whenever they need their score to be higher, this kind of thing.
Surveillance awareness and social behavior.
Now, do you think the fact that individuals are fully aware of the way they are being surveilled and the extent to which they're being surveilled has a strong impact on their interaction and their adherence to the criteria of the social credit system? There's a difference between being surveilled by your government but you don't know and being surveilled by your government and you do know. If you're being surveilled by your government and you don't know, then obviously you don't have any extrinsic motivation to change your behavior. At least knowledge of the surveillance won't be an extrinsic motivator. But if you know that you're being surveilled by your government and you know that your government is going to reward or punish you according to your social behavior, to what extent does that motivate your social actions beyond mere performativity? Do you think that people will seek to understand how the system works? Do you think that they can gain an understanding of the rules of the social credit system, or is it more like a black box?
From what I aware is that every Chinese people have the awareness of being surveilled by their government, but they don't have the outcome or the results of whether they are going to be punished or being rewarded by their behavior. It is more like a black box right now because it is a new system. I don't think it has been like nationwide now, so not many people knows about the system and they are not being rewarded yet or being punished yet. So they don't know about the rules. But what I have known is that the Chinese people would have the guideline themselves, because some people will have more understanding or they will be the front runner in the system. So they might have observed or have already written something down and share online to teach people how to gain more score in the system and to be rewarded or have the benefits the government promised them they will give. The other thing is that Chinese people would categorize themselves as the good people. So if they are being surveilled, that means that they only need to just modify or abide by the guideline, just to a very little extent to have their own freedom. But because other people are bad people, they think about that they are bad people, so they have to modify a lot of things. So this system will protect them because of this. They are bad people, so they have to change their behavior. Like they couldn't do any more crime, they couldn't harm anyone else. So Chinese people can have their own safety and have their own privacy and have their own freedom, because other people, especially those bad people, will have to behave and to be a good citizen in the society.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see to what extent the social credit system actually has a genuine impact on the social trust crisis, and whether or not people learn to trust the system, I guess. But again, if you know that you are gaming the system, then you must be aware that other people are likewise attempting to game the system. Consequently, is your social trust in others really going to be heightened by this system?
It is interesting that Chinese people think that themselves are being surveilled, they are being monitored, but they will assume that other people are being taught, or they are being instructed by the government. They have to do the good deeds, they have to be a good citizen. So the society will become civil society as they have promoted.
That gets back to the difference between the way we see ourselves and the way we see others. And this occurs in all societies. We attribute to our own actions good and moral motives, and we have much more of a tendency to attribute to other people's actions less favorable and even negative motives.
Author's personal conclusions.
What were your personal conclusions at the end of your thesis research?
I think the most interesting part is that foreign literature always forgot to see is the individualism in Chinese people, because they really have their own thoughts and their own way to deal with this kind of authoritarianism country. So they know how to dance with the government, how they can still have their own freedom in this situation. So what I have learned is Chinese people is not that easy to manipulate it. They still have their own thoughts and they still have their own behavior they wanted to protect. And they are not going to abide by the book. They just know, if they know how to manipulate the score, they would do that. But it's not to be benefits or have the reward. They just wanted to still use gamify the system and grab their own freedom. That's what the most interesting part for me. The foreign literature always fails to take account the individualism in Chinese people. Yeah, I think this is the most interesting part. Also, I think the other thing is that people actually not that welcome, even though they try to they want the government to solve the problem of distrust, but they are really reluctant to have this system in their society, and they have a lot of resentment toward the government as well, because what they have promised them or what they have done is actually quite opposite or not really, because a foreign scholar always assume Chinese people, I guess because they couldn't talk with them, so they always assume that Chinese people will welcome with an open arm to welcome this system in the society. But they actually is quite reluctant to this system because it will deprive their rights, and they even didn't know what the government would do with this data, because they say that they try to solve this problem, but Chinese people have lived 70 years under the rule of CCP, so they know that CCP actually always break their promise, or they didn't really follow what they have promised. They always change or twisted what they're trying to do originally. So they are afraid that maybe social credit system is for this thing, but actually it's for another thing that they didn't know.
Government and gaming the system.
Since the Chinese government will surely be aware that individuals will attempt to gamify this social credit system, do you think that they are going to be taking any countermeasures in order to try and defeat such strategies?
I think all this, like the goal or the purpose or the whole measurement, is all in the black box. So even though they say that they try to solve this, actually I think maybe social credit system is just a cover for what they're really trying to do. Like they're actually trying to snitch out the people who are not loyal to CCP or the people who might be potentially trying to overthrow this government.
Government and ulterior motives.
So you believe it's quite possible the social credit system has an ulterior motive, not merely to solve the social trust crisis, but rather to extend surveillance over the people and allow ways of modifying their behavior in such a way as to identify who is most amenable to behavioral modification and who are the people who are resistant to government control, who may be potential dangers.
Yes, that's what I think. Because if their purpose is actually trying to fix the long-lasting problem, it shouldn't be this complicated. The infrastructure should not be this complicated. So from what I see from a Taiwanese perspective, it feels like this government is up to something else.
That actually gets back to a point you made previously about how even some Chinese citizens view that the system is over-engineered for purpose, right? The level of surveillance seems to be far more extensive than is necessary to achieve the stated goal, and the extent to which the government is attempting to modify social behavior seems to be well beyond what would be necessary to address the social trust crisis. Is that right?
Yes, because like 50% of my interviewees are women, and most of them are, I think 100% of them are reluctant to the system, and they think in the end, if the system is actually trying to control their own freedom, they will have to flee. They have to flee out of their country and try to immigrate. Because this is too far. It means that they even couldn't complain about their own lives. Then maybe it's not really related to the policy or related to the government, but somehow it might be very sensitive.
Social credit system and socialism.
Given that the Chinese government claims to be socialist and claims to be fundamentally Marxist, and further claims to be working towards a fully socialist society in the perceivable future and ultimately towards a communist society, did you find that your interviewees make any ideological comment on how this kind of social credit system is compatible with Marxist ideology or is in some way compatible with socialist ideology? Did any of your interviewees comment on this from that Marxist ideological perspective?
They really don't think about this socialism or something. They just think because Chinese communism is actually very far away from the Marxism or the socialism that we know about. My interviewees who are CCP members think this system will realize the Mao's communism for them because it means that everyone is an open book. So there's no secret and you can just modify or to teach the citizen how to be civilized. Because all of my interviewees are at least bachelor degree or even master degree, so they actually have a higher education level. They think that currently China is still a very barbaric society because people is still lying about things and distrust each other and couldn't be like their ideal European civil society. So they just think this system can reach the goal of their ideal communism.
It is true that fundamentally Marxism as an ideology is intended to be adapted to the material conditions of the Marxists in their own society and community, wherever they are. And of course, Mao famously appealed to that when he described the ideology that he was defining and following for China as socialism with Chinese characteristics. It is true, therefore, that fundamentally Marxism will take different forms in different countries and in different social environments depending on the material conditions. The question is, of course, to what extent this is really motivated by Marxist ideological concerns and other concerns, as you've raised, and the extent to which this is going to achieve what are fundamentally Marxist ideological goals, or rather, if it's simply attempting to achieve goals of the Chinese government, which may or may not be directly, or in fact even at all, related to Marxism as an ideology, or communism, even socialism as an ultimate goal. So it seems like, as you said there, the Chinese government's justification is that the Chinese people are fundamentally unruly and need to be governed very strictly, and some kind of social control program is necessary in order to assure conformity. And I know traditionally that has been an argument given in the past in Chinese literature and in Chinese history, even modern Chinese history, as the justification for the imperial dynasties in the past. The idea that, well, China is so large, made up of so many different groups, each with their own special interests, and there's so much historical conflict between the groups that some form of authoritarianism is necessary to bring this rather unruly rabble into some kind of order, which may seem rather counterintuitive and maybe even insulting from a Western perspective, but it's certainly a prevailing view that we find in China, in Chinese literature, and obviously historically in Chinese political discourse. In fact, if you go on Quora, you will find very frequently Chinese correspondents on Quora defending the Chinese government's authoritarianism on those very grounds, insisting that democracy doesn't work in China, can't work in China, the culture is too different, the people think differently, it's too dangerous to have people expressing their individual thoughts, the government needs to define a way forward for everyone and then maintain social order. They appeal to the chaos, as they call it, of the previous centuries, insisting that Chinese people need that firm authoritarian hand. So from that perspective, I can see that people would be amenable to being persuaded that this social credit system is serving Marxist ideological goals insofar as it is necessary to bring people who are unaccustomed to a certain way of thinking to a form of behavior which is going to realize the socialist program and then ultimately the communist program of Marx himself. The extent, of course, to which any of that is true and the extent to which any of this is necessary to bring about those goals obviously is hotly debated.
Author's final thoughts.
Is there anything else you'd like to say in conclusion?
The whole world always think China as a unit, but actually the province in China is quite different, especially when we talk about infrastructure or like social credit system. Always Taiwanese people would think about is that how could it be nationwide, because the coastal cities and inland cities are quite different, because it is wealthier in the cities, the infrastructure in the cities is more developed, but the inland cities or villages didn't really have electricity yet, so they really couldn't be monitored by the system. But how come it can be unified, or then how come China can apply consistently if the difference is that vast? So it always, when Taiwanese people are talking about this system, we always think about the purpose of this. Because if it is really nationwide, you should build the infrastructure inland as well. But they really don't do that. So how come we can say that it is for conformity purpose, or how to educate the whole Chinese people? Because they really don't do such a thing. Talking about democracy in China, like I just said, inland village is quite different from the coastal cities. So actually, inland village, they don't have the control by the central government, so they have wider extent of freedom in their own society. So they even have their own like votes or their own rules, which is not abide by the book that the CCP wanted. Then how come this system can be applied?
Thank you very much, Jane. That's been extremely informative, and I really appreciate you providing this kind of introduction to your thesis. And I look forward to analysing it in my next few videos.
Thank you.
Finally, I'd like to thank my generous patrons, Elias Asvig, Chloe, Duran Barnett, Alexander Curzon, Sean A. Young, Andy Chaos, Tibby LTP, Thors, Fake Name, Niels Rethlin, Judge Sabo, Matthew Simmerall, Thomas Leonard, Martin T, Ben Lindquist, John Larkin, Jack C, Ezekiel Stacey, and Love You More. Please contact me if I ever pronounce your name incorrectly.